Public schools throughout the country are not only changing the way students are being taught, but they are also changing how students are being tested. So how are students tested now? Find out on Talking with Henrietta, coming up next. Hi, I'm Henrietta. Welcome to the show. The Common Core Standards, a new education system that became a required method of teaching for public schools throughout the country, is completely changing the way teachers are teaching students in their classrooms. This different teaching method is bringing with it many changes in how public school students will be tested. On this show, we'll take another look at the Common Core Standards and closely examine what the framework for the new public school tests look like, what the goals of the test are, and why they are completely different from previous testing methods. I have only one guest with me today, Dr. Gary Waddell, and if I must have only one guest, then Dr. Waddell is the person to have. He is the Deputy Superintendent of Instructional Services for the San Mateo County Office of Education. He formerly served as the Associate Superintendent of Instructional Services and as the Curriculum Services Administrator for the San Mateo County Office of Education. He is the immediate past chair of the California Curriculum and Instruction Steering Committee of the California County Superintendent's Education Services Association. He also has other credentials that are too numerous to mention in my brief introduction. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So for those who have not heard the term Common Core Standards, why were they considered necessary? Why the change?
California was really one of the at the forefront of the standards movement nationally. Our last standards were an advancement in how we thought about what students knew and are able to do. The Common Core state standards really took that to the next level. They are standards that were developed by many states. They are internationally benched. They are focused on college and career readiness, and really some of the best minds in English language arts and mathematics came together to put these standards together. So they really are the next logical step in a standards movement and offer really good opportunities for children to think differently and to experience different kinds of instruction and skills in their classrooms.
Well, given what you've just now said, all of the advantages in terms of college and career and getting children to think, there is a lot of opposition to them.
Yes.
And what's the opposition based on?
Well, there are a lot there is a lot of opposition to the Common Core standards, but really we find that they offer many benefits to students. They are, they really just structure. Some of the thought is that they tell teachers how they need to teach, and that really isn't the case. They tell us what our students should know and be able to do, but those decisions about the materials that we use, about the instructional methods that we use, those are local decisions made by local schools in our state and across the country for those states that are participating in the Common Core. So it really, we find that it really changes our way of thinking about teaching and learning with students. And the assessments are, of course, very closely tied to that. And all of those are really a hopeful sign for our educational system. Deep ways of deeper ways of students thinking and synthesizing knowledge and bringing together the kinds of things that they know and are able to do.
Now, you said that some of the decisions will be made locally and other decisions nationally, but the core of the training, the core of the teaching is the same nationally.
So the standards that we're trying to get our students to reach are the same nationally for those states that are participating in the Common Core. But the ways that teachers teach those, the kinds of instructional strategies and techniques that they use, the way that they, what materials they bring in to introduce, you know, for example, in English language arts, ways for students to be able to analyze a text and to think critically about what's there and to choose a position and learn how to defend it from the text that's there. Those kinds of things, the strategies our teachers use really are ones that that are developed locally, and that are a matter of really between the interaction between the teacher and students, as it should be.
So as I listen to you talk about looking at, let's say, a paragraph and understanding what it's all about, I think that's what I was taught in school. Wasn't that what you were taught in school? So what's different about all of this?
What's different about them is really how we've structured the learning experience. Our previous standards, while they were good for their time, really you couldn't vertically align. So that means you couldn't really track a student from 3rd grade to 4th grade and see that there was a clear progression. These standards are built on just that, what are called learning progressions. So it takes a standard really from transitional kindergarten all the way up to 12th grade, and how does that standard progress over the grades. So
if there was a certain amount of work you had to do in, let's say, 2nd grade, that would prepare you for 3rd grade. Supposedly that would prepare you for 4th grade. So wasn't that a natural progression from kindergarten to 12th grade?
It was, but this is a much more kind of sequential progression. In mathematics, for example, it brings in what are called the mathematical practice standards, and so there are skills that develop across different spans of grades that really intentionally, and that bring in some of the kind of habits of mind that students need to develop as well. So it's a much more cohesive and intentional way of thinking about what students know and can do.
When you talk about habits of mind, can you give an example?
The one we were speaking about a few minutes ago, how to read and analyze a text rather than just being able to repeat some facts back that about what happened in a story, but really how to delve deeply and analyze what an author is trying to do with a character, or what the subtext of a story is, or some of those sorts of deeper ways of thinking about reading and language arts.
So you're saying there's less learning by rote now?
I would say so. We had, you know, in our former assessments received a lot of criticism because they were multiple choice fill in the blank. And what we learned is when you attach high stakes to an assessment, instruction tends to gravitate toward that because we all want our children to perform well. So when that was multiple choice, fill in the blank, that had an impact on instruction. When we're looking at assessments that are more performance-based, that are deeper ways of knowing, that involve kind of authentic experiences with children, that also has a draw on instruction, and we think it's a positive one for children.
So you're saying now teachers can't teach to the test? Because I think before in the classroom, the teacher knew what was going to be on the test and could give the students materials that corresponded to the test.
That's right. That did happen sometimes. These are much more, the level of rigor in these assessments is much higher. There are some multiple choice sections, but these are also computer adaptive tests. So where students before took paper and pencil tests, these are on the computer, and they're adaptive, meaning that if I answer one question incorrectly, the next question might be a little bit easier, so it could really hone in on what I can do. And the reverse is true. If I'm answering questions correctly, it'll raise the level, so it really can, we're not just looking at whether a student can pass a proficiency cut mark, but really what do we know and are able to do. So that's one of the exciting things about the test.
It makes me wonder when you talk about students beginning to think deeper. There is a lot of inequality within the school systems. So how is this set up so that those who have less in less affluent communities can still achieve and compete with those in more affluent communities?
Well, I think the exciting thing is that these tests really are about structuring our those habits of mind and preparing our children for college and career. And I mean, one of the things we know is that children, whatever communities they reside in, have incredible potential. So this is really an opportunity for us to think about what can we do as schools, as a school community, to provide the children what they need to achieve that potential. And these tests are, you know, they will look very different from what we had before. They'll be more rigorous in many ways, and I think it really raises the bar for all of us in positive ways.
Yes, it seems when you talk about something being more rigorous, if certain students aren't passing them now and they're more rigorous, wouldn't they be more likely to be left behind?
Well, so the first time they take the test, I think it will look very different. One of the things that the computer adaptive nature of the tests that I was just talking about, where it will really hone in, it'll give us much more specific information about what children are able to do, not only in the broad categories of language arts and mathematics, but also in some more specific areas in each of those subject areas. So we'll have much more kind of actionable information. The other thing that really is a nice feature is that California purchased the digital library for every child in California. Many states, schools or school districts had to pay for that themselves, but California supported that for all of our districts. And those materials have a couple of things in them. They have interim assessments, so schools can test children, you know, over the course of the year and kind of assess how they're doing leading up to these assessments. But also, they have a digital library of tools and resources that teachers can use in the context of instruction to really deepen instruction and learning, which is an exciting feature because really, this isn't about how you do on a testing day or days. It's about how your instruction is responsive to your needs over the course of the year and how, you know, prepared you are really to do well and to excel in the next grade level.
You mentioned computers a lot, so these tests will all be taken on the computer.
That's right.
For children who don't have computers at home, wouldn't they be at a disadvantage?
Well, so schools have spent the last couple of years ensuring that they were ramped up and prepared to offer the assessments on the computers. The multiple choice section of them, the computer adaptive part, is on the computer. There are also performance activities that happen in the classroom that aren't. The larger question really is, and the opportunity really, with those computers now that we have, is how do we use those day to day in instruction in ways that deepen teaching and learning. Not that just replicate what we were able to do yesterday with paper and pencil, but that really give us the opportunity to do things we could never have done before, that connect us with other students and classrooms, that expand the walls of the classroom, give us access to information and materials that we couldn't have done if we were just relying on a book. So that's, I think, the opportunity.
And how does that look? Isn't that all dependent more or less on the programs that you're working with on the computer?
Well, so it can be. So it certainly is at the County Office of Education, we consider that a very important part of our professional development task, because now certainly there were schools and districts that had computers and technology. There are more that have them now. And so I think it is, as we begin to have conversations, or as we continue these conversations about what instruction needs to look like today to prepare children, not only for these assessments, but for the Common Core and for their lives beyond, it also is an opportunity to think and have conversations about what instruction looks like that uses that technology and that really leverages it on behalf of students.
So let's talk about that. What does instruction look like
when
that
it's like
leverages the technology.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what's different? I understand now teachers won't just be standing up in front of the classroom and the students repeat what the teacher says.
Right.
So what will happen?
So we think, I think it can look very different. I think many of these classes are decentralized, so it's not just a teacher standing up and everyone listening and everyone in the classroom being on page 112 of the textbook. But it really is about differentiating instruction and personalizing instruction. So that's one of the opportunities in technology, to use data, to use not just summative data that happens at the end of the year, but formative data that really is data that a teacher can collect from what I do today that informs what they do with me tomorrow as a student.
So what does that mean when you talk about personalized instruction?
So it means that in a classroom, instead of everyone being on the same activity, that it'll be individualized. So in the ideal scenario, there's some sort of pre-assessment that says, well, so these students have already mastered that skill, so we're not going to have them spend time on that skill. We'll let them go on to the next thing. These students are struggling a little on that skill, so we'll pull them and reinforce that skill. But we don't want to, one of the things we don't want to do that is a mistake we made in our past in education was relegating students who are struggling to that track where they had to experience that every time. Technology gives us the opportunity to let students move flexibly in and out and have instruction that really is about what they currently know and are able to do and keeps pushing them. We'd like to talk of it as at the instructional level is somewhere between mastery, where I can already do this, it's not a challenge, and frustration, where this is so hard that I'm just gonna, I can't try. So somewhere in the middle of that, I'm able to be successful, but it's also a push for me, and that's what.
And the goal is at the end of the school year that regardless of where a student started in the beginning of that year with the personalized instruction, it's hoped that everybody will end up having mastered a certain prescribed set of information.
Well, that's true.
Certain skills.
Well, and so
if it's a progression, so that they're ready for the next grade, the next step.
Well, and one of the opportunities with these assessments, and we'll be watching the reauthorization of ESEA, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, at the federal level, because one of the conversations we have a lot is not just assessing students in terms of a proficiency cut score. So we don't want to just know if you're able to cross over that score, because then let's say the score is here and you went from here to here, you still weren't there, but you made a lot of growth, and maybe you're here and you went down, and we don't know that. But if we're able to look at how much growth we would expect a student to show in a year and bench it on that, then that gives us a lot more information about how successful we're being with that child.
So what about that grade? Will the grading system still be the same? Because if the student moved from here to here and should be here, and the student who was here fell down, what does that do in terms of the grades?
Well, a lot of that part is still being developed, but I think what we would like to move toward is saying how much growth would we expect a student to make in a year, and then bench their progress on whether they met or exceeded that mark or didn't quite make that, rather than whether they hit some arbitrary cut score.
So that student will get an A on the basis of how much progress they made, as well as the student who hit the mark.
Well, so that would be an individual teacher and school decision, those kinds of grading practices. The Common Core and Smarter Balanced assessments don't dictate local grading, but it's always been in schools a combination of how students perform on their assessments, which give us some kind of objective measure, as well as their teachers' experience with them. And none of this replaces that deep interaction between teachers and children. And that's the same thing is true for the technology we were talking about. The technology that really matters and is impactful is technology that deepens that interaction between teacher and child, that doesn't try to replace it. So
much is dependent on the computers. What oversight is there in terms of the operation of the computers themselves?
Well, so I think one of our opportunities now is to think about how those computers are used, to ensure that schools have in terms of the bandwidth and the infrastructure that they need for students, not just all to be able to take the test on the same day, but for classrooms really to be places where there are many devices that are operating, and teachers are able to work with students on accessing those devices and using that.
So in a classroom, for example, and it's testing, all students will be tested on the same day under the same computer system? I mean, that when you mentioned bandwidth, so I'm thinking, what happens if there is a computer failure or
so there's a testing,
the internet goes down?
Right. Well, so there's a testing window that schools have that they begin testing after a percentage of the year has been completed, but then they have until late May to finish these assessments, for example. So so they have these tests are different because students can come back to them, and so it doesn't all necessarily in fact it doesn't all happen in a day, because there are also some performance kinds of tasks that students do that are part of these tests, which are something really different for us in California.
Well, as we talk about what's really different, let's just talk about the process. So it's testing day. Students sign into an individual computer. They're presented a test. How are they identified by the computer?
So they have, student identification numbers and that sort of thing. They would take the English Language Arts computer adaptive section, for example, and then do perhaps a classroom activity that's related to a performance assessment. Maybe it's about having conversation or some information as a group in terms of a historical period or something like that. And then the performance task would be something related to that. They do have, part of the challenge, and why it was really nice that California gave us the opportunity last year for all students to experience the field test with no scores returned. So it was in a no stakes environment, because there are also tools of the computer that they have the ability to use. For example, in math, there might be an electronic protractor or an electronic ruler that they're able to use in specific items or something like that. So
and these are, of course, tools that they've been using all along in the school.
That's where they need to be, yes. That's why we want the technology incorporated in the daily context of instruction. So these aren't new things or new experiences for kids the first day.
But that child has done is saved in the computer. What happens if, is there a possibility that information is lost?
Well, so I think these are very robust systems, and they're operated at the national level. So of course, while anything is possible, they've done lots of redundancy testing and to ensure that the reliability.
So have students been tested under the Common Core standards?
Some have begun. They've just begun recently in the last few weeks.
Any results?
No, we don't have any results yet. We won't. Results won't be returned until after the last student or the last school in a district has completed testing, and that's a much wider window than we had before, because schools can kind of put that. There's a amount of instruction that needs to be completed first, but then they have the flexibility to decide when they're tested in that window. And so some schools, for example, if they're testing in a computer lab, might have a grade level go in and do that in the lab, and then they're doing something in the classroom, and the next day another grade level is in there or something.
So when was the Common Core standards rolled out in the San Mateo County School District?
Well, so they were adopted by the state in 2010 by the State Board of Education. They had been in development for a number of years before that. So our state board adopted them in 2010, and then we had a few years where the Common Core really were the adopted standards, but we were in kind of a difficult spot because all of our instructional materials were still based on the former standards. Our assessments, the STAR tests, were still based on the last standards. So we were saying, learn these, and really it was the time that we worked with teachers and the kind of teaching force to understand these new standards, because it was a bit of a time where you were learning a new thing while still doing and being tested on the old one. So last year was the first year when we really got rid of the old assessments.
Completely.
Yes, students didn't take the old assessments
At the beginning of the year or at the beginning of the school year?
The last school year they didn't. The last school year they didn't take the old assessments at all. They took a field test of the Smarter Balanced assessments, but didn't have scores returned last year.
Okay, so how were students promoted, or?
So it was based on their grades in their classroom, the assessments. So schools sometimes do their own assessments. A teacher might do assessments. A school or district might have identified assessments, and so it was based on those things. Not standardized.
Assessments, are these based on the teacher's individual perceptions of the students, or is there something that's an objective measurement?
So most schools and districts had some sort of system that they used last year, and it was a 1 year moment of shift from the old system to the new system.
Did they all correspond?
Yes. So
I'm thinking if the individual schools could decide on their own assessments.
Oh.
Did these assessments correspond across school districts?
So schools all use a variety of measures, and multiple measures is really the best way for us to assess what students know and are able to do. So that was already happening, and the standardized assessment was one kind of data point in that universe of things that we look at for kids. So then they didn't have that statewide assessment, but it really was a plus because we really were at a point of ramping up the Common Core. It was going to be the first time students experienced these very different tests. So I think it was a big assist for our kids and for their teachers and schools that we had a year to, let's all try this new system before scores are coming back to count.
The thing about it is some might think it's a disadvantage. If there are no scores, then how can students be rated and passed on to the next grade if there are no scores?
That's right. Well, we're back this year. This is the first operational year of the test, so we'll have scores this year.
So everybody last year was just passed on?
Well, they weren't necessarily passed on, but the teacher in school made the determination based on multiple measures. As those things have always factored in how you've performed on your assessments in the classroom, and there are some kinds of mathematics assessments that many schools use that are called Mars tests. So those kinds of things people still used, and districts made decisions about how for that 1 year of transition they would assess students. And now this year, students have just begun this testing window for the first operational year. So they will have scores this year. They will certainly have meaning this year. They'll have more meaning next year because our scores, as we were discussing, we're looking at growth. So this will kind of be the benchmark year, and then the next year we would be able to see how students grew from that point. So
it's my understanding that formerly there were API scores.
Yes.
And it's my understanding that even realtors sell houses on the basis of the API scores in the neighborhood and the school district, but there are no API scores. They have been suspended.
That's correct. So last year the State Board of Education paused the API system because we didn't have scores. So they just, at their meeting this past month, abandoned the API again this year and are moving toward developing a system of multiple measures. So the question really, and it went to, the State Board really considered it strongly, and it went to a public schools advisory group for their input about is one score the best way for us to assess students in all of their complexity and all of the various dimensions that we're looking at them, or is some sort of system of multiple measures going to be a better way for us to look at what students know and are able to do? And so the State Board committed to investigating some sort of multiple measures kind of approach. It hasn't been developed yet. The Department of Education is kind of busily working on that.
So if it hasn't been developed yet, and it's a multiple approach on which to judge students, then how are students being judged?
So there are two parts of, so there's assessment, which are what the tests they take, and then there's accountability, which is the meaning that we make of those tests. So they will still get a scale score back. It'll show a band and it'll have their score and kind of the level of, the range of reliability of that score. And it will show it in comparison to how that group of students did on the field tests the last year, just for this year. In the future years, it will show how they compared to the score that they had the previous year, so we can really see if they're making growth.
And districts will still be compared with school districts.
Sure. Yes. Yes. So we will still we'll have the same type of system. We don't know what it will look like, but I think it's exciting that it will consider more than just boiling everything down to one single score. And we can look at more of the dimensions of really what make a student who they are and successful, and it'll give us a deeper way of knowing.
Now, there's one thing to have an assessment. There's another thing to have different tests for students. If they're not multiple choice and they're not something that's very structured or strict, their responses, who's doing the judging?
So that's a good question. So there are a number of components of the current assessment. So there is a multiple choice section that is computer adaptive, as we were discussing, so it modulates questions up or down depending on how you answered the previous one, so it can really hone in on what you know. There are also the performance components of these assessments, and those might be where a student writes an essay or analyzes or compares two positions and picks a position and defends it or something like that. Those will be scored by teachers throughout the country that are being because they're not just filling in a blank, they are generating a response.
However, it makes me think individual teachers would see different things. I mean, I would write a paragraph and give it to one teacher, and that teacher would have a different opinion of it than another teacher. So each teacher would have, so
how do you grapple with that?
And is that fair to the students, since so much depends upon what an individual teacher thinks?
It's true, but it's not their teacher necessarily, it's not their teacher at all that's scoring it. So, and we've grappled with this for a long time, for example, in writing prompts and when we've evaluated student writing. The process we tend to go through is training the evaluators, so kind of using anchor papers, saying these are at different score points and what different papers look like, these are the components, and then we're going to teach you that and then let you try some, and we're going to assess how effectively you're rating what these are. And then most of these systems use, perhaps you would have a couple of people that score it and see if they're in alignment, and if not, someone that else would come in and kind of evaluate it. So I don't know the specifics of this particular assessment, but typically when we have student generated responses, that's how you
I'm just thinking you could have 3 evaluators and there could be a whole range of a big range between one and
it's true.
And so what then, where does that leave the student? What score might be acceptable?
Well, it's about how effectively you train those evaluators, and you have some checks and balances that perhaps you and I both read a student paper, and if we both independently agree, there's some confidence that, but if we were, we had different scores, maybe someone else would come in and evaluate. The value of that, while it is, as you can hear, it's much more complex to evaluate, but we get so much more information from a student's piece of writing or from their working out some sort of real-world application of a math concept and seeing really how they're applying all of that than just if they checked one of 4 boxes or something like that.
That's very true. But I'm thinking, if you check the wrong box, you're wrong. And if you check the right box, so there is no either or, it's either right or it's wrong. And there's something to be said about that. Now, that does show a certain level of mastery. What is it, rote learning or good guessing?
Right. I mean, so, we would hear many of those stories of folks that would teach strategies, eliminate the ones that that are incorrect and then choose from the ones that were remaining. So they certainly gave us some information about students, but there's a much deeper kind of information that we get from these kinds of assessments. And because we're now preparing students for these kinds of assessments, it also kind of raises the bar for all of us in terms of the kind of instruction that we provide, that engages students in these higher order thinking skills and building those habits of mind to be, thoughtful thinkers, but really kind of how they grapple with complicated text, for example, how they make decisions. Do they have, in math, there are some practice standards that kind of span across the grades that are just those kinds of habits of mind we're talking about. And that's really the opportunity, so that we don't end up again with a system where people feel that students are just checking boxes and we're not really assessing in deep ways what they know and can do.
So this is a question that might seem a little strange, perhaps, but the Common Core standards are geared towards what, developing deeper thinkers?
That's a component of them. They're really geared to preparing our children for college and career readiness. So preparing them beyond for their lives beyond school. One of the aspects that I've always felt was really important was this, as you say, being deeper thinkers, being able to grapple with, to synthesize various bits of information and knowledge that you're learning, so it doesn't just live in that box, but you're able really to apply it to your world. One of those mathematical practice standards is modeling, which means, can I take what I've learned, this algebraic concept or whatever it is, and apply it in some sort of real world application, which means that I really do know it at a deeper level than just being able to solve a problem and check a box that that's the correct answer.
Sure. Now, the public schools can change the system of a different teaching method, but are the public schools and the Common Core standards in alignment with the colleges? Because you're preparing students for college, but you're preparing them in a different way, and you're using different tests in which to do it.
Yes, that's right, and they are. The higher education was involved in this whole process of generating these. There were members of them on the Smarter Balance Governing Board, representatives from higher education, the California, the UC and CSU systems have been in support of this and the opportunity it's providing for our children. So they've been at the table, with us in developing these and implementing these all along.
So they're not going to be looking for API scores?
No, because there won't be any. So
yes. No, you've talked about Smarter Balance. Go into some detail explaining what Smarter Balance is all about. So
there were 2 assessment consortia that were approved at the federal level. One of those was called PARC, and one of them Smarter Balance. One of the chief differences, PARC employed what were called through course assessments. So you had part of it at various parts over the course of the year.
And that part, is it PARC?
PARC.
P-A-R-K.
P-A-R-C-C. And that, so that California was initially with that consortium, but early on switched to Smarter Balance, which is a California-based system. The unique feature of Smarter Balance are those computer adaptive tests that we've been talking about that hone in on students' responses and what they're really able to do. And then the performance assessments. I think both systems had those, but those are another important part of them. And the exciting opportunity there really is because just what we were talking about a while ago, we know that instruction kind of morphs to follow the kinds of assessment that we're doing. So if we have assessment that models what good instruction really should look like, with students being able to converse and explore deeply and analyze text and think more critically, that's a positive thing for our kids, rather than, as you were talking earlier about us, places where we just prepared children to be able to complete a multiple choice paper and pencil test.
Now, you mentioned in talking about Smarter Balance that it's developed in California. So it's within the California school system.
No, it was based in, so each of them had each of the two consortia had kind of a base, and it had a base here, but it was developed nationally.
Okay. So if a student moves from California to another state, would what he or she is doing be recognized?
Well, so that's
on the
a very
same
good
level?
question. It would, if they went to another state that is a Common Core state using Smarter Balanced. One of the opportunities in terms of kind of stepping back from the individual classroom with this assessment is this is the first opportunity we've really had to compare how California students are doing in comparison to students in other states. We've had very rigorous standards before. Some states have had similar ones, some states have had much less rigorous standards. We've assessed in a certain way. Every other state had their own way of assessing students. So it really was comparing apples and oranges to try to say how our students are performing in comparison to other states. So this is the first time we really have that opportunity.
If the student is going to another state that uses Common Core standards, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But if the student isn't, it seems maybe the student might be at a disadvantage because the person doesn't have the API scores or some of the other scores that more traditional school systems might still have in place.
But they wouldn't, but no more than they would have already, because API was a California-based system also. So they already didn't have that opportunity at other states. So there's much more likelihood that they would go somewhere now where their scores were relevant than before.
Can you say how many states might be opting out of the Common Core standards? And is this something that's permanent? Is it something that's temporary, that might change as the standards are better understood?
Well, so I don't have the number. I know that there are a handful of states that have opted out for various reasons. California has been a strong advocate and supporter of the Common Core from early on. So that's been a real plus, that we were committed. As I said, the state board adopted these standards in 2010. The governor in the past years have given dollars to local school districts to help prepare teachers and to use for this technology or purchase new instructional materials. And we're kind of fully wed to this new assessment system. So California is all in, which has been a real plus, that there hasn't been a question about whether we were committed to the standards or not. I think states have different understandings of them, and they're certainly critics of the Common Core, but my belief is many more advocates of it because of the opportunity it provides for our children.
But not everybody sees that opportunity. Obviously, the states that have opted out don't see it as an opportunity for the students.
That's right. Some perceive that it's. I think there are some misconceptions that it's the federal government telling us what we teach and how we teach and those sorts of things. And this is not a federal government initiative. It was a consortium of states that put these together, and it really is just about having our standards saying students should know and be able to do these things at different grade levels. But then how they teach, how teachers teach, the materials that they use, all of those are local decisions, just like they always were, and as they should be, because it should really be that teacher assessing the child in front of them, saying, they know best what their needs are.
It seems if it's up to the local school districts, what materials they use, then there isn't a commonality. I'm just thinking North Carolina will decide, well, we want to teach about our southern past, or like Texas or Mississippi. And those materials would not be the same as those in New York or California.
So the the standards, though, they wouldn't be able to say we're going to teach something different about something different, because we would still have those same standards.
And we're talking about in English and math.
English, language arts, and
primarily.
mathematics. Yes, the next generation science standards are in development, so that'll be the next piece that comes.
So the material for teaching those concepts in English and math vary, but the concepts do not. The concepts remain the same.
That's right. That's right. So, so a local school board would decide what instructional materials their schools were going to use.
And it might not be Cinco de Mayo. They can decide to leave all of that out.
So let's say we're in a classroom, and what we need to be learning about is how to expository writing, or how we write a piece of text. So a teacher might use different materials to help us master that concept. So they wouldn't have to be the same one, and one teacher might have us do that by working in small groups and writing, and another teacher might approach that through showing a model and say, let's practice this model. So those kinds of instructional decisions that teachers make as professionals, and the kinds of materials that local school boards adopt for their children to use, are local decisions, but it doesn't change what those content standards are that our children should be able to do and will be evaluated on at the end of the year.
So we're focusing on, a good portion of the show is focusing on the tests themselves. So where do we stand in terms of the tests? And over the course of the year, how many sets of tests can students be expected to take?
So these assessments have just started in the last few weeks, and they will go through the end of May, and so students will take them at different times. Those assessments, they've just started in California. As you can imagine, many schools and districts put them kind of further on later in the school year than at this beginning part of the testing window. So there are a lot of assessments that are starting. I don't know the number but I know the first couple of weeks there was a lot of attention paid to the system, ensuring that that it was responsive if there was a glitch or a problem, that teachers could get within a couple of minutes someone on the telephone or an email or some kind of response of technical assistance, and that really went very well. The scope, of course, of California, we have more students, than many other states combined. I think the scope is much greater, but the consortium really was, I believe, prepared for that, and it was another benefit of that field testing experience last year. So it not only gave students a chance to experience this assessment without having to worry about, am I held responsible for the score? It let teachers really say, okay, see what that was going to look like, but it also served as a test of the system to ensure that the system was robust and wasn't going to crash.
It seems that there is a lot of dependence on the system.
Sure.
And if a computer fails for an individual student, is there a backup someplace?
Sure, and students, in this assessment, students can come back to it again. So there would be an opportunity if something did happen with an individual device or something like that.
The only thing about it is, can you imagine if you're taking a test? I guess the test would be the same if the student came back to it. Would the student get that same test?
Sure, they would log in
with
it.
And they could have the opportunity to answer it differently? Or if they weren't feeling so well that day, they may not do as well that day. So those things aren't taken into consideration.
So they are. I mean, it's not just a kind of free form, but I think there were a lot of concession or accommodations made to ensure that those kinds of technical glitches, the students didn't suffer if a computer had a glitch. And there was a great deal of testing of the system to ensure that it was robust. And
I think almost like of the election that we had more than a decade ago, where they were hanging chads.
Yes, that's right.
It was a robust system, and it was well tested.
I know. I guess I would really say that I think this is such a deeper way of us knowing what students know and are able to do. And there was such a kind of general consensus that the fill-in-the-blank bubble sheets weren't serving our children well, And I think it's a very promising for our future. And the state, I know, is looking at how this, all of this as an accountability system with local testing, with what our local control accountability planning, that with our new state funding model looks like, planning around for schools and districts to plan around these priorities that the state has set and local priorities, and what all of this looks like in terms of accountability. So at their most recent meeting, the State Board of Education really was laying out a plan for how they would connect all of these pieces in an accountability system, a comprehensive system.
So obviously all of the answers aren't in yet. It's still
No.
it's still in development.
Absolutely, absolutely. But we're 5 years into the Common Core standards, so we're on pretty good footing with them. It's our second year of our first full operational year of the assessments, but we had a year of the field testing last year. But we will certainly continue to learn as we go. We're not there yet, but I think it's promising for our kids.
So we have thousands of students taking tests via computer. Where will the test results go? Are they all going to be sent back to New Jersey someplace, or do individual states have their own centers where the information goes?
So scores will come back in a number of ways. Students,
Where will they go?
Oh, I don't.
I mean, where will the tests go? If I sit down and I fill out something on the computer,
where are the servers and that sort of thing?
Do I press send?
Yes. So where the servers reside,
sent?
I don't really know. But
into cyberspace someplace.
That's right. That's right. But I do know we have seen just recently what the student reports will look like, and those will come back, a couple of months after the last school finishes testing. A local district will receive their scores. So that's another nice thing about this being technology-based. We'll get all of that information much more quickly than we did in the past.
Is it sent to some central place? I mean, there?
It would go electronically, so you don't send. I couldn't tell you. I'm sorry. But where the actual servers live, but then it's just
or what group or what board is
the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, UCLA was their contractor for doing a great deal of this gathering of this information, but I wouldn't swear to that. But so where the servers physically reside, I don't know, but I do know that the results come back. I know that it takes a little time. The computer adaptive part can come back very quickly. The performance part that requires individual people, real people, to look at it takes a little bit longer, but it's much quicker than we had in the past. Schools would struggle because they wouldn't be getting student scores back sometimes until the next school year had begun. So it was very difficult to base your planning or decisions on what that data showed.
I'm thinking especially if you're a senior, right? And you have to give final scores to
That's true.
a college?
And with Smarter Balance, we assess students in grades 3 through 8, and then once in high school, which is in 11th grade. So they would have their 11th grade score back.
And what happens for 12th graders?
So there's only one, that 11th grade assessment is the high school assessment. So they're evaluated annually in grades 3 through 8, and then once in high school. So they would have, they would use other forms of assessment, but in terms of Smarter Balance system, that's where they would be assessed.
So when will we have an opportunity, at what point do you think, to test the system in terms of whether the Common Core standards are actually leading to an improvement in terms of really educating our students so that they are competitive with other nations or competitive with other communities?
I think now we begin to know that. I think as we give this first round of the operational assessments, we'll know, we'll have that first data set, and then as each consecutive year, we'll know how our students are progressing on those, and we'll be able to adjust.
So heaven forbid, if the students aren't progressing
Yeah.
the way everybody is anticipating or would like?
Well, so then the same thing we did before when they weren't. We need to look at our instructional programs. We need to look at the kinds of support opportunities we have for students. Those are the kinds of conversations that happen at the school and district level. How do we support our students so that they can achieve their potential?
So we might, well, you said it's all in process.
Yes.
It's all a work that's being put together. Have we left anything out in terms of what viewers should know about Common Core standards, about the tests, different methods of assessment?
Well, I think one of the things that it's important to know is that these scores will look very different from our former scores. So we really can't compare them with, that's one of the, another benefit that will no longer generate an API, because there won't be an API to compare with the old one. It'll be a new kind of score. And I think that's appropriate because our students, these are very different kinds of assessments than our students have taken, than our classrooms have administered. So I think we all need to kind of let go of what that looked like in the past and begin with this new system and see where it
So
lands.
the scores are different. The scores will be different.
Mm-hmm.
What might they look like? I mean, will they still be like 0 to 100? Will they still be like from A to,
Right.
letter grades?
We've seen recently the first sample of what the student reports will look like, and they look like a kind of a scale score where the student scored, and then kind of a confidence band about, with what degree of confidence we think that score really is in this band. And that this year is being compared to the field testing last year. That's not a direct comparison, but it at least gives you something to bench that score against. And then as they begin to progress forward, it will, we'll compare from year to year and see how students are growing, which really is the heart of it.
Well, I think, I certainly hope that we've gotten to the heart of things in talking about the Common Core standards and where we are now and what's going on. It's a complete sea change in how teachers are teaching and how students are being tested. And I'd certainly like to thank you for coming to share what these revolutionary changes are all about. We'll keep an eye on it and see what happens.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. I'd certainly like to thank our viewers for watching. Until next time.